All right. Well, thank you, Honorata, once again, and thank you, Jacek, and to all industry partners at the Warsaw Security Forum. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next session, a high-level panel discussion on great power competition, balancing China's and Russia's raising air and missile defense, air and missile power. While the United States missile defense system has been the subject of debate for quite some time now, Russia and China, too, are competing to develop their own strategic missile defense systems, raising extremely important questions for transatlantic strategy. Our moderator for this discussion is Lieutenant General Mary Legere, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence of the United States Army. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Legere to the stage.
Okay, we give simple directions on where we're supposed to sit, and we managed to get it wrong, but I have great hopes for the potential of this panel. Well, good morning, and welcome to everyone who's here. As he said, I'm Mary Legere. I was the former senior intelligence officer for the Army, and I'm now a global advisor for Accenture. And I'm honored to be here at the Warsaw Security Forum and congratulate, as others have done, the sponsors of this, organizers of this great discussion. Today, we're going to take the third conversation to the next level, and our topic, as she mentioned, is great power competition, balancing China and Russia air and missile power capabilities, and the threats that they present to both NATO and Indo-Pac allies in terms of planning assumptions, deterrence, and the defense of their territory. It's my pleasure to have a panel of 139 years of experience, so I'm going to be doing very little work. I will say that our Deputy Secretary General, Lin, is the youngest. He only brings 20 years. So if you quickly do the math, you have to divide all those other years for these gentlemen, not to say that you're old. But it's my pleasure to introduce our panel from the United States, a man who should be, commander who should be familiar to all of our NATO allies, U.S. Air Force retired Jeff Harrigian, call sign Cobra. Welcome.
Thank you.
And as most of you should know, he was your former commander of the Air Force and USF Air Force for both Europe and Africa, as well as being the senior Air Force component commander for NATO for a 3-year period. So Jeff, thank you for being here. From Poland, Major General Wiśniewski, call sign Cezary. He's a MiG-21 pilot. He flies everything else and you fly MiG-21s. His call sign, Cezary, he has 3 decades of experience in some of the hardest jobs, and currently he serves as the Deputy Commander for Polish Armed Forces. From the United States, an old friend, Mr. Heino Klinck, no call sign, but 40 years of experience, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. He's a former Army colonel, former Foreign Area Officer, and is one of the foremost experts in the United States Defense Department on security plans and assistance, as well as modernization strategies, as well as having been the former DAT for Beijing and Hong Kong, one of our true China hands. And finally, from Taiwan, we welcome Deputy Secretary General Mr. Fei-Fan, who has for 2 decades been helping his government. Well, he said since high school, so I'm just going to give him that. But he has been advising his government, his political party, and now his president on matters for national security and defense. So please join me in a round warm welcome for these audience. Now, for those of you who are lucky enough to sit in the last panel where the idea of air superiority and its assumption as essential for success on the battlefield, you know there was a lot of emotion around that. And for most of our lives, in the United States, NATO, and Indo-Pac allies, we've long assumed we could achieve and sustain air superiority based on a number of factors that we were all highly committed to, which included the idea of collective defense, attention to joint operations, smart sovereign investments in the right capabilities, aerial systems, next-generation aircraft, integrated air defense, ISR, and mission command. There is also amongst all of us the idea that we must adhere to a regular training schedule and regime and come together and spend that money to ensure that we're ready as a group. And then really attention to adaptive doctrine to ensure that we don't just fly the way we want to fly or defend the way we want to defend, but we're paying attention to what the adversary brings us. So for most of our lives, we've just presumed air superiority, we've got that. And yet for the last 10 years, we've seen massive investment, both by the Russians and Chinese, and the offsets for that. And they have prioritized air and missile technology modernization, integrating them into a more modern integrated air defense system of systems, including expanded and long-range surface-to-air missiles, advanced radars of such an array that it's almost difficult to keep up, mobile and multimodal launch platforms, the integration of cyber and electronic warfare in ways that we haven't seen before, as well as an investment in their ballistic weapons. And so the assumption that we have in NATO and Indo-Pac of those first few weeks, our air forces will be ready to provide that cover so our ground operations can proceed, is one that, candidly, we really can't assume is there. And so that's what we're going to kind of talk about today, is what is the reality around that today. And I'll ask each of our panelists a question, but then open it up to you, hopefully, for some additional questions. So we drew straws, and because he's the oldest and wisest, General Jeff is going to go first. So Jeff, since the war's inception, we've seen the impacts of Russian and air missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, and the fact that they're targeting power grids, oil refineries, armaments, and manufacturing plants. And those have intensified as the war has continued. Do you believe at this point, this obviously was a concern of the audience here that wonders what is it going to be like if there is a fight tonight in NATO, but do you believe NATO and its allies and partners today have adapted to better protect key infrastructure and critical capabilities, facilities away from the front lines, should the Russian operations continue to the west? And then the question I like as the follow-up is, how, as you, as one of the commanders, how do you prioritize with NATO allies, both for sovereign and alliance targets?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So tough question, and I think one that many of us have spent a lot of time thinking about. And I would start first by making sure we're clear-eyed and acknowledge what the threat is. And our understanding of the threat needs to continually evolve, as you highlighted, given the digital nature of the threat and what both the Russians and the Chinese are doing today. From a broad perspective, are we ready? Well, we're going to be ready if it happens. And, you know, I'll look at Cezary, and we've talked about this several times, and as airmen, we recognize our duty and what that means with respect to delivering some level of air superiority, whatever that might be. Now, to do that, I think there's an important part that's a foundation to it that begins with information sharing across the force and ensuring we collectively understand and then leverage that to build the appropriate capabilities and capacity and numbers that allow us across, and I'll leverage NATO here as an example, to be able to deliver what we're asked of. But to do that, I think importantly, we've recognized the importance of building capabilities that are connected, that talk to each other, that are integrated from the very beginning. We've learned that if you don't integrate by design from the very beginning, it becomes very challenging to connect your assets. And the power of connecting and facilitating across the joint force, not just in the air, but across the joint force, is what will allow us to achieve the objectives that you're talking about with respect to identifying the critical assets, recognizing we'll never have enough resources to protect everything. So we've got to work with the nations and understand their priorities, and then look at what we have to highlight and protect those assets that now become defended across the force. And that's a work in progress. We spent a lot of time thinking about it, but not one that you suddenly get the answer and go, we're good. This is something that continually evolves and one that we've got to work together to ensure we understand where we're at and how we execute as a team.
So I'll follow up on that. The fact is NATO has been an incredibly busy alliance for decades, even though the Cold War focused on Europe, but in Afghanistan and other places around the world, and has practiced in joint operations very frequently. NATO nations join in exercises and operations to maintain that integration, but you've been the commander on the ground. How many exercises do we need to make sure that new systems are onboarding, new countries with new capabilities are onboarding? I'm thinking of the numbers of aircraft and advanced aircraft and systems that are being purchased and introduced into Europe, both European, Korean, as well as the US, providing those systems for you as a commander that is inheriting not only great airmen and women, but the Star Wars bar scene of equipment. How hard is it if we don't get integration right at home station?
Yeah, there's some challenges there, and Cezary and I have talked about this in some very specific instances where clearly, while we had the desire to connect, what we ended up having to do is recognize there's limitations with what the nations bring. There just are. And so from a training, tactics, techniques, and procedures perspective, you have to have that ironed out. And this is what we did. In the buildup, as we saw what was coming, we ensured we rehearsed together. And I don't mean that just from an air component perspective, but with the joint force. So you've got to be able to take the information, and the beauty of what our young men and women do is they get to answers. They find solutions. The charge to everybody who goes and buys capabilities for them is to listen to them, because they're going to tell you what they need. And if you're buying a cool widget because it's a cool widget, probably not the answer. And those are the things, as we look at how we better integrate from the beginning, we need to have as much bottom up as possible to understand where the gaps are and then leverage that to find solutions.
Well, thank you for that. We're probably going to come back to the issue of integration and multi-domain toward the end, and we'll see where the audience wants to take it. But now I want to go to our other call sign, Cezary. By the way, if you ask a question, I'd like to have you nominate yourself for a call sign, so be thinking about that in advance. Okay, Cezary, you know, obviously we've seen the proliferation and importance of drones and their wide adaptation, both by the Ukrainians as well as the Russians on that battlefield. We have seen them not only have significant operational and strategic impact, but also creating a psychological strain on the forces on both sides. The air defense units, the forces on the ground, as well as civilians. As one of the most important leaders in Polish defense, deciding what you train on and what you focus on. And you've absorbed these key lessons. As you reflect on your own country's modernization priorities, do you believe there's been a sufficient focus on how Poland, as part of NATO and as a leader in NATO, is going to help contribute to this, to combating this specific growing threat of these systems? Do you think there is enough collective effort intellectually across the air commands to think about UASs, both small and large?
No, thank you very much. It's a great question, high above my pay grade. But I would say that yes.
Just go for it.
Yes, that's true. In Poland, we have witnessed a lot of new technology, new TTPs and ideas, the doctrine about how to operate in air domain. And Ukraine is a great example about the development of this since the war broke or since the Russian unprovoked aggression on Ukraine in February 22. So yes, it's absolutely true. We're working on that right now. So what we're doing in Poland, we are trying to think about the modernization, just maintain what we thought, what we introduced already. We're doing a lot of experiments right now, just trying to introduce the new idea and check it out. Because if you move to the wrong direction now, the next generation is going to suffer. You always have a limited resources how to spend money for modernization and sustainment. So right now, we are not in a rush, we are not in a hurry, trying to understand what we're supposed to do to bring more capabilities to our military, especially if we're talking about the drones. There's like a new ideas and and new capabilities don't know before FPV drones, which change the battle over the Ukraine right now. You know, historically, the bigger losses for the tanks was artillery. After that, anti-tank missiles and anti-tank rounds. Right now in Ukraine, we observe that FPV drones are the most sophisticated weapon system to stop, damage, or destroy the tanks and other armor vehicle. But what does it mean for us as a planners? You know, I have a lot of, in my stockpile, I have a lot of weapons or the rounds which are not perfect suited for current conditions over Ukraine. So we have to rethink this, how many anti-tank rounds we need on our stockpile if the war looks like over the Ukraine right now. We don't like this picture. So this static war in the trenches, it's not something we think in NATO about our operations. So the mobility is a very important piece of our thinking, how we are going to fight and win in the future. But we have to take this under consideration, how to allocate resources to develop the capabilities which will be the most suitable for the war to come. And the piece of our thinking is, of course, not only the new technology, but how to select, how to train the people. That's a big challenge, I believe, right now for everybody. And just we see that maybe that's a great field for a cooperation with industry and with just new ideas.
Yeah, there's two ideas there, and maybe it's Jeff, a quick answer, but I think every country in NATO is taking lessons learned and looking at their air component and their ground component and their maritime component and saying, okay, did we overinvest here? Did we underinvest here? Is there a collective effort? Jeff, he's at the 4-star level, so there's no rank above him, but former 4-star, is there a collective effort amongst NATO to kind of get at group homework here to speed what could be hybrid solutions in a rapid way so that we can really integrate what Ukraine is trying to teach us?
Yeah, I think Cezary is a great point. And ultimately, this is about layered defense and how do you leverage all the capabilities that are available to you. I think the challenge becomes how do we do it at speed that meets the requirement that the warfighter has today. And from an industry perspective, we have a lot of people, companies leaning into it, but how do you orchestrate it to get after the specifics that they require? Okay. That's the challenge.
All right, we'll come back.
Can I follow one more thing?
You can.
You know, a lot of people think that, you know, the drones, small drones, FPV, so like a cheap stuff, easy to get, easy to use. But, you know, think about it, that right now, United States made a decision to develop the work on a replicator initiative, which cost $1 billion. That's the new program to search for counter-drone capabilities. How much we have to spend actually to develop something which is effective during the war, during the
So maybe it's piling on that, to have someone take lead and everybody contribute great ideas. Okay, on that, we're going to shift now to another part of the world, but taking the problems of Europe and bringing them into Indo-Pac. Heino, the Chinese and Russians have long cooperated on weapons development. They don't always give each other their best stuff, but they do provide some significant enhancements to one another. Russians in particular have influenced the Chinese SAM development. The Chinese in return are extraordinarily good at radar development. Russians would probably argue they are as well. We could throw it in the middle and let them fight over it, but they're working together. And that's really important because what we see in Russia doing in Europe, the Indo-Pac nations should anticipate seeing something like that. And what we see in terms of the advanced investments by China to not only be a peer, but to be a world leader on advanced aircraft. Thanks for stealing our homework. And you know, some of their stuff looks remarkably similar to a lot of the systems that were built by R&D dollars by nations in this room. But they're making an effort. So as somebody that has bridged the gap between countries and looking at modernization strategies, always focused on what the threat is. What do you make of, what's your impression of the level and depth of cooperation between the Chinese and Russians, specifically as it is to present dilemmas for NATO and Indo-Pac air planning?
Well, if you look at Russian-Chinese cooperation over the decades, going back to the Soviet Union times, it ebbed and flowed. And for most of the history of military cooperation and defense modernization cooperation, it was usually the Russians providing key components or key systems and capabilities to the Chinese. That has now reversed course for a number of reasons. And the Russians are definitely the junior partner in that relationship. To date, about 70% of machine tools that Russian defense industry requires are manufactured in China. About 90% of the electronics in advanced Russian systems come from PRC. And I just saw a media report last week that said that the Russians actually are operating a drone manufacturing plant in China. So if you take those examples and couple that with the rhetoric, whether it was Putin's visit to General Secretary Xi just weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, to the continued high-level embrace, both figuratively and literally, Xi and Putin, I think it's clear to all of us there is a nexus there. And I think it's also clear to all of us that, as recently retired Secretary General Stoltenberg said in Washington, about 2 weeks prior to the Washington summit actually, we can no longer separate the world into theaters and regional security from global security. It is all connected, whether we want to admit it or not. It is absolutely all connected. And then if you add to that mix the DPRK supplying weapons to the Russians, the Iranians, at the end of the day, it is all connected. And I think those of us who've been watching these challenges for a while have been saying this for a while. And I do believe that there may in fact be some limits to the no limits partnership between Russia and China. At this point, I think the Chinese are committed to ensuring that the Russians don't lose. Maybe not necessarily win in Ukraine, but don't lose, because they see implications for their own designs on the region, and in particular regarding Taiwan.
And I think it's a really important point for our NATO countries to consider, that the arsenal of autocracies or authoritarianism brings the Chinese might behind Russia. So we can exhaust Russian supplies, but is it endless? And we need to think about that. And particularly as we consider our relationships with Russia, there are relationships between NATO nations and China due to trade or to supply chain dependencies. Do you think it's evident enough in the discussions at the highest level, and maybe that's what our NATO secretary was trying to foot stomp, that Russia or China is contributing to Russia's ability to endure on the battlefield? And how do we address that as an alliance?
Well, I think some of the trend lines are positive in NATO and the European Union, although we are not where we need to be. But let's recall, it's taken a war in Europe, just one border away from where we are today, to get Europe, the majority of NATO countries now, to actually invest in their own defense after having committed to the 2% mark 10 years ago. It's taken a war to do that. I hope that it doesn't take a war in East Asia to get to the same point. But the other point we need to remember is not just the military cooperation, but it's the cooperation between Moscow and Beijing in all elements of national power. And the fact that the Chinese have demonstrated time and time again, they will use all coercive tools at their disposal to achieve the political ends that they seek all over the world. That includes economics and commerce. And in Europe, again, I don't think many of our European friends and partners have come to the conclusion yet that they are at risk, at great risk.
I think in the last panel, they talked about additional sanctions against countries or companies in Europe. Again, the supply chain is coming from Beijing, and we need to have that discussion. So now I'll bring it to a really tough neighborhood and a tough problem. In Taiwan, you obviously watch carefully because your existential existence relies on you understanding the Russian or the Chinese modernization plans, but also the Russian relationship. What Ukraine provides is China an opportunity in an operational theater to see what equipment works and what doesn't. but you see other levels of cooperation. So one, from a Taiwanese government perspective, what would you message to all of us about Russian and Chinese cooperation, and perhaps a little bit more sophisticated or broader understanding of where sanctions are going to be important? And then further, do you have any, as our politician on stage, or a government leader, do you have any suggestions of things that aren't being done that you might suggest?
Yep, thank you, Mary. This is a very tough question. I totally agree with what Heino just shared with everyone here. I think we would look at the fact that the Russia and China's relations, look at the fact that 20 days before Russia's invasion to Ukraine, what their high-level officials, senior officials, public statements, what's their public statement? They say Russia and China, their cooperation is actually a strategic one. They say their friendship and cooperation, first, is no limits. Second, is no forbidden zone. Third, is no ceilings. So 20 days after Russia invades to Ukraine, that's a fact. And what have been happening in these 2 years, we see the region, whole region, the war Russia fired against Ukraine haven't ceased. The tension in the Middle East is rising. But in Indo-Pacific, they're not stopping. The reason why I'm saying this, look at the fact that how many military drills they have been conducting in the region, across the continent. You see that in Indo-Pacific, usually in the past, from 2013 to 2023, you see that actually every year, China and Russia conduct a joint military exercise. But usually, it's around, from the public record you can find, it's usually around 4 times to 10 times a year. This year, until now, this moment in October, it's already exceeds 11 times of joint exercise. That's just from the record. There are a lot of things that we haven't been actually put into records. I think a lot of intelligence service actually watching closely of what they're doing. So they are practicing what? They're practicing their interoperabilities. They are practicing what we just mentioned, that what is lack in the coordination among NATO allies, among the countries in Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific countries, especially, that we need to improve the coordination. We need to improve our interoperabilities for the militaries. But the first stage we need to improve is that we need to share the information and coordinate with the regional allies and partners, and to let each other to understand that what is happening exactly. But to be honest, that there are a lot of mechanisms. I'm sitting on this stage. To be honest, Taiwan usually have no such chance to really participate in certain ways of coordination, participation. That's something that we're deeply concerned. Well, I think that what we can do together to look at the fact that and share the information among the allies and partners in this region, especially in Europe. I want to tell everyone that China may be softening their diplomatic gestures here, especially in Europe. But none of their action to expand their powers, military exercise, military powers to Indo-Pacific has been stopped. None of those actions been stopped. So watch the fact that they are doing one thing in Europe, they're doing another thing in Indo-Pacific. But these two theaters actually combined. I totally agree with Heino sharing that these two theaters are highly connected. It's actually not the European theater, not the Indo-Pacific theater. It's only one theater that China and Russia is coordinated with each other. But one last thing I want to mention, China is definitely not the peace broker. It's not. They are the conflict maker. They are the conflict maker. What they're doing is fueling Russia. They are supporting Russia through economic, through trade. They are now trading in renminbi. Actually, in June, 99% of their trade is conducted by renminbi and rubles. That's already happening. Through economy, to the military exercise, they are practicing their interoperability. So now, that's a question, how we can coordinate with each other in this room. The country all participate in this room. We need to work with each other to improve our defense and to strengthen our deterrence.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So as you're thinking about, thank you. As all of us have spent so much time in the discussions, ensuring that we understand we're in a global war against the significant adversaries who have common interests to create dilemmas for the United States to prioritize, for Europe to understand that some of the supply chains that you're supporting from your industry are in fact being turned against your own defense. And so having a sophisticated understanding of the world we're living in, we started with the topic of air power and missile defense, but it begins in small ways and it ends up with big effects. So thank you for that. You left us, we've got about 5 minutes and I recognize we need to go to the audience. Jeff, I'm going to give you one question as the former director of the F-35, which I think was the punishment before you got to go command, so I'm not going to listen to too much agony. But we talked about the power of this alliance is our ability to operate seamlessly inside each other's decision, to see the world the same way, to bring what we can to the fight, to optimize each nation's ability to contribute. You know, we talk about a global maritime land power. It is not us, the United States, against China. It's China and Russia against all of the naval forces of the common allies. But to have that work on the battlefield requires attention to integration, not just ammunition, interoperability of ammunition, but integration of data, policies that allow information sharing, decisions by countries like Ukraine to take their national data and place it in a cloud so other people can access it and it can stay safe. You've been at the forefront of integration of the physical parts of the air domain. Could you talk a little bit about where your Air Force now is going in terms of creating a command that's going to focus on that integration of digits and data so that we can save time? And I think that will be our last question, and then I'm going to give you just a few minutes.
Yeah,
so be ready.
I'll try to power through this quickly. In the United States Air Force, we're standing up the Integration Capabilities Command, which is an important part of recognizing from the beginning that you need to look at the data, and I'm careful to use that word because my question always was, okay, what data are we talking about? And leveraging an understanding of how we look at a specific problem. And I say this to the point of, this can be a bit of world hunger, very hard to solve. But if you break down, whether it be a specific kill chain in the Far East, a kill chain in NATO, decompose that and look at where the data is moving, where humans are involved, how much is actually machine to machine, where you could use algorithms or AI to help solve those kind of problems. And now you can incrementally over time get to the integration you're talking about. But as nations, and I'll highlight this for NATO, sorting out this discussion on data and a chief data officer and organizing yourselves in a way that facilitates the discussion from the beginning and is an important part of what we learned in the Air Force and one that we need to share with all the nations as we continue on this journey together.
Well, thank you. I guess the shocking point is the machines don't know to connect. It's the humans that help them connect. And if you in NATO nations are looking at your organizations and you do not have chief data offices, and yet you talk about integration with NATO, or you talk about Indo-Pac integration, go back and do that, because we need to make sure that that happens. Okay, we've got 2.5 minutes and every other panel has run long, so we're gonna try to squeeze out a little more. I see a hand. Could you identify yourself and your call sign?
Hello. Jacek Karczewski, I'm from Poland. Well, it's been 30 years since I served in the military, and I was in the land forces, but let's say Maverick. Right. It's the easiest one to name. Two short questions. First one, in the previous panel, General Ben Hodges said that in the worst case scenario, it would take 2 weeks to move stronger forces to Lithuania if there was a let's say, dramatic situation. I'm sure that even flying from Alaska over the Atlantic, planes would get there faster. So in the next few years, until we solve those logistical problems, should we put the most emphasis on Air Force and generally air power, which can come quickly to the aid of the frontline countries, namely Poland and the Baltic states, etc.? And second question, during all of this forum, there have been many calls for immediate accession of Ukraine to NATO. Should there be also immediate recognition of Taiwan as an independent country? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to let you take the first one, and I
Well,
think I know what the answer is going to be on the second one
yeah,
from you.
as an airman, I'm going to say, yeah, put money in air power. Yeah, that's a good call. Having said that, though, the recognition that it's going to be contested to move logistically is first well understood. And, you know, Cezary, you can talk to this as well. Second, I think as a joint force, we need to think, number one, how do you deter that from ever happening? Position yourself, proper posture, exercises, and be visible to the Russians about what we're doing so they know we're ready. Finally, I think the idea of continuing to train together to ensure that we're ready to execute that mission will be incredibly important. And I'll pause there.
And you have 30 seconds, and I think we know the answer.
Sorry, I know that I know every conditions in every individual country that has a totally difference. I mean, this context, political context, diplomatic context is totally different. We understand that. But I hope that maybe we can move slightly from the current point to the next stage. We can do certain things together first. As I suggest, and also Heino just suggests this, at least we can do that, like at least some of the practices. And of course, information sharing is very important practice. And to have that kind of foundation and build that kind of trust, and then we can move on. I know there's definitely different contexts, but I will just want to share this. Thank you.
Okay, unfortunately, I know we have an incredible amount of questions coming from this audience, but we've got this timer that's about to blow up in front of us. First and foremost, on behalf of all of you, I would thank our panelists who have helped us in 50 minutes get a feel for the complexity of this. I think we should be reassured by the focus. This is representatives from our military. We have been working on this problem for a long time. We don't turn away. Hard is not hopeless, as we like to say in the United States Army. If it's hard, we can solve it. So, gentlemen, thank you for everything you've contributed. I'd ask all of you to give them a great round of applause. And finally, they'll be here, so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to ask them some questions. But thank you to Warsaw for this great panel. Thank you very much, gentlemen.